Stephen, I'd like to come back to you and pick up where we left off a couple moments ago. You know, you were dealing with getting the precursor chemicals, but that was one aspect of this story. There was another that involved direct contact with some cartel members. How do you arrange something like that and do it safely?
Yeah, I think that was one of the key things we were trying to do was to really get an insight into the whole supply chain. So one part of it, as you say, was talking to people selling this stuff in China and getting delivery of that and making sure it was what they'd said it was and wasn't sugar, etc. Um, and then the other part was to try and understand uh, what the cartels, what it looks like on the kind of receiving side here in Mexico and the production of fentanyl, turning those precursors into fentanyl. Um, the most, so we did that through a combination of things. Some of it was done on the ground in Sinaloa, talking to cartel members. And my colleague Drazen Georgic was the one doing that. And yes, that was mostly done through contacts that we have and through a fixer as well, who has contacts in Sinaloa, and a relationship with the cartel. That we were able to get some of those interviews where we could really understand how they were using those precursors to make fentanyl.
Hmm. And again, is that something that is this is something you can do one time or a very limited way, or is it something that you're covering that story, the cartels, on an ongoing basis? Is this something that you said, okay, we did it once, that's it, we're not going to push our luck, or is it something you tried to do in other ways, covering the story as it moves on?
Yeah, no, it's something. I mean, it's something. It always each one of those trips takes a huge amount of planning, a huge amount of risk assessment. We tend to try and do it, in and out in a pretty fast way. You're really not spending, you're spending as little time on the ground as possible. But it is something that we try and do. Uh, Regular is too strong a word, but it's not something we try and do once because understanding the situation on the ground, understanding uh trying to get access to inside the cartels and understand what they're doing and how they're thinking is really important. And not it means that you're not relying entirely on law enforcement, whether that's US law enforcement or Mexican law enforcement. So getting that kind of other side of that it is important, even though it's incredibly hard to do. And it really depends also on the cartel, like CJ&G, for example. El Mencho was just recently captured. Historically have kind of zero relationship with journalists ever. It's a very, very hard cartel to get inside at all. Sinaloa cartel traditionally has a slightly different relationship with reporters. And obviously, El Chapo famously kind of met with Sean Penn and stuff. I mean, there's a interest within the Sinaloa cartel to get out some of their story. And so it's still very difficult, but there are kind of ways that you can arrange interviews or talk to at least certain members of the Sinaloa cartel.
Uh-huh. Mexican journalists have been trying to cover it and being killed for many years. Any change in that? Are they still trying to do very challenging stories? And is it any safer or more dangerous? Any change in what we've heard for many years on that front?
It's still incredibly dangerous. I mean, I think it's and the really difficult thing about the kind of drug war in Mexico is that certainly in terms of victims and violence, the people that really bear the brunt are local reporters. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is also the types of stories that they often do. Uh, a lot of the journalists that have been killed in Mexico are kind of local reporters reporting on very local stories. The connection between organized crime and local politics, like for example, the mayor of the town where they might run a blog or a small newspaper or a media site, and they've managed to expose, corruption and links between organized crime and the local politics in that town. Um, and those are incredibly important stories. But unbelievably dangerous stories to do. Where you're naming people and at that local level, and a lot of the journalists that have been killed have been doing those kinds of stories. And it continues to be an incredibly dangerous place to do that
Yeah.
kind of work.
Yeah, yeah, sure, understood. Nilu, I want to talk a little bit about the satellite companies that provide photos to journalists. I think you touched on that earlier, and we have a question from Bill Holstein, and I'll mention to everybody in our audience, feel free to put in questions. We're getting to the last 20 minutes or so. And he's saying there are some reports today that the Trump administration is trying to crack down on companies that help journalists analyze satellite imagery. Have you heard anything about either this latest report or just any change in the way these satellite companies have been operating when it comes to photos from Iran since the war began?
Right. I mean, this is a problem that even precedes Iran because, the two main satellite imagery companies that most newsrooms use are Vantor and Planet. And they're great. Planet even will engage with independent reporters and provide imagery for research. Like they really understand the mission. Part of it is, as I mentioned at the top, for Vantor and I'm not sure with Planet, but I do know for Vantor, one of their top clients is the Department of Defense. And we ran into this problem. I don't know what is time last year when we were reporting on the presence of Israeli military in southern Lebanon. Satellite imagery companies told us, well, we can't actually show you, we can't provide this imagery because we're not able to show you the position of U.S. troops or allies of the U.S. And so that absolutely affected our reporting. We're seeing that with Iran play out now too, right? So as Iran started to, in the beginning of these strikes a couple of weeks ago, started to retaliate by hitting, U.S. bases and other targets in the Gulf, some of the U.S. bases, we started to see there was a delay. Then they said, now we're only going to provide imagery after 14 days. And that's high resolution imagery that is so sharp that you can, see exactly what was hit or count what aircraft exactly, how many pieces of aircraft have been hit on a runway, for example. That's really helpful in our reporting. It helps us understand how successful was Iran at hitting these targets. And so, yeah, I mean, I understand from the satellite company's point of view, the Department of Defense is their client, but also they'll say things like, well, Iran could continue to use this intelligence if it's disseminated and reporters put it out there. These are their arguments, but it makes our job really difficult. And now we're even seeing a 96-hour delay of imagery coming from Iran. And that we need that. Like if the US struck Kharg Island, which is 90% of Iran's crude oil exports, we need to see that imagery. We need to see exactly what terminals were destroyed, and it helps us make sense of what happened. So this is absolutely a huge issue. I didn't deal with it personally with Russia and Ukraine, but I heard this was also an issue for some of our colleagues looking at that conflict. But yeah, with Iran, it started very, very quickly.
So yeah, just I'm doing the math in my head here. So it's basically a 96-hour delay from Iran these days. So
Yes.
if President Trump announced, I believe on Friday night, that Kharg Island had been hit, so Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So have you seen any imagery of Kharg Island being hit, or do
There's
you
other
expect to see it
forms.
about
Yeah.
now?
There's other forms of imagery. So the high resolution imagery is what we're not able to access. That's being able to see things really clearly. There's other things that we can do in remote sensing. There's free satellites like Sentinel, Copernicus, these other things that are out there, but they don't show us like details very clearly, but you can put specific bands, specific lights, for example, specific colors, for example, that can show, oh, this place was destroyed, but I may not be able to see precisely which buildings. But there are other things available to reporters, but we just don't get that clear, crisp imagery as fast as we want it. And that's a huge, huge challenge for us. I was doing a training last year at The Hague and doing an advanced open source training. And something one of our trainers said was, this is a problem that they run into as well. There's a number of Chinese satellite companies. They're not bound by the same contracts, right, that the US is, but we don't have access to those. And so it'll be really interesting to see what this next phase of imagery might look like, what companies might step in, or will we continue to see? I mean, frankly, it is a form of censorship, even though we can understand why certain companies will have this. It censors our work as reporters and it limits our access to information.
Right. And just a quick follow-up. If you're a freelance journalist and you want to talk to one of these companies, as you said, it sounds like they're, depending on the case and various circumstances, but they might be very willing to help. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
I mean, I'm freelance now. I've been working doing different stories with New Lines magazine at the moment. Planet has been really lovely. We might ask them for imagery and we might even say, like, we won't publish this, but we just want to look at it for our reporting in order to do the analysis. Planet is very generous. They've been very generous in my experience in these last few weeks.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Mohammed, I want to go back to when you had to make a very hard decision about whether to stay in Gaza or leave Gaza. As we've noted, you're in New York now, but you faced a very hard decision. Tell us a little bit about what went through your thought process and how you left Gaza.
It was not a decision that I was really planning to make, and when I had to make that, it was not, such an easy one, honestly. It was a place where I was born and raised. It is a place where I loved and where I studied, where I had my as a journalist, my first ever assignment where I was, navigating how to, figure out life in the midst of everything that was going on. And so in April 2024, I have arrived at that point where I couldn't continue to do my job safely the way I wanted to do it. It was no longer feasible. It was no longer viable for me to keep holding both the story and my life at the same time. And it was clear to me by those threats and escalations to that were directed my way through the Israeli military, that I could not continue to operate safely as a journalist, and I was still under the radar, even though I had been targeted a few months before that. So they made it clear to me that, through a number of text messages and phone calls, even after we survived the bombing on the house after December 2023, that I was still being watched, and they explicitly said that you survive the first strike, you're not going to survive what's coming next for you. And so at that point, I had to consult with family and be like, this is not going to be safe for me or for anybody here. And so I think there is a plan that we have to follow, which is leaving Gaza, evacuating through the Gaza City all the way south, and then exiting through Rafah to Egypt for the Rafah crossing. At that point, the Israeli military had not yet um, made its way into Rafah, and it didn't have actual control on the crossing. Like, they didn't have physical control over the Rafah crossing because, like, the military tanks raided Rafah, and they actually shut down and sealed the crossing on May 7th, 2024. I left in April 2024, so it was 1 month before the military invaded Rafah. And on my way exiting Gaza, on my way evacuating, I had to go through the military checkpoint, which was called the Netzarim checkpoint. It was a military base for the Israeli military where they split the strip in half, the north and the south, and I had to make my way through that, checkpoint. Although it was such an enormous kind of a challenge there, because I was making my way out and showing myself to the very same people who wanted to kill me a few months before. And so I was picked up at that checkpoint. I was split from my family, and I was held into interrogation and questioning in that military base for 4 hours, where I didn't know what was happening to me or my family. I was denied access to um, food. I was denied access to legal consultation. I was denied access or communication with anybody outside. I was interrogated and questioned, and they did not make it clear that I'm going to be permitted exit at some point. But still, eventually, they were like, "You're free to go, and you're good to keep moving." And so that decision was not any easier at that point. Once we crossed the north of Gaza, there was no way to, go back in there. It was a one-way kind of journey where people were encouraged and forced technically to move and make their way, to the south. Basically because the north was like in a place of that unsustainable kind of humanitarian condition. The medical system had collapsed in there. People didn't have access to medical treatment. They didn't have access, to enough food and nutrients and supplies, and to, any kind of life-sustaining necessities. So people were asked to move to the south, and once we made our way there, I had contacted a number of friends and colleagues on the other side of the border, including people in the US and Egypt and some Arab states that coordinated the mobility of us through the Rafah crossing and facilitated our exit through the crossing into Egypt, where we arrived in
let's
there.
just note was not cheap, and it was not an official
No.
service charge. It was, you had to pay a large bribe to the Egyptians.
It was basically a coordination job with the Egyptian authorities that were in control of the crossing on the other side of the Rafah crossing, on the Egyptian side. And I think the entity that was in control of the crossing that back then, it was the Egyptian military. But from the Gaza side, I think it was officers that belonged to the government in Gaza that worked and operated under the direction of the Hamas government back then. And so these people were in charge of letting people out and facilitating entry. But the people, the evacuees, the people who wanted to leave and flee, they had to coordinate their own exit through these channels and submit the paperwork and the money to the Egyptian authorities, and then wait for approval for something that we call security coordination, which means if you have approval to leave, then you're getting cleared by the Egyptian authorities to cross into Egyptian soil. If you were not, then you were deemed a security threat and you had to stay in Gaza. There were a number of people who were able to, provide the funding to pay the payments that were, enormously, like they were huge, extraordinary amounts of money. And at that point, it was $5,000 per person. And so when I left with my wife and my toddler, who was 2.5 at the time, we had to pay $15,000 only to cross the border into Egypt. And then once we're there, we were stamped entry visas on our passports and our Palestinian passports that allowed us to stay temporarily in Egypt as evacuees. And that's when I started coordinating. As soon as I left Gaza and settled into Cairo, I started working on the evacuation papers through the same process exactly that I went through, but for my parents and sister who were still trapped in Gaza, and I managed to evacuate them only mere hours before the operation in Rafah started.
Wow, wow. Incredibly harrowing story from start to finish, Mohammed.